this episode of Quakerism. In this video, I wanted to talk about something that happened in a conversation that I was having with someone on Twitter, and it was talking about, I think we were talking about conservative Quakers, which is a whole branch of Quakerism. And I was saying, oh yeah, I really quite like a lot of what they talk about. And I've got traditional Quaker Christianity, which is one of the main books made by conservative Quakers, and thought it was really good, really helpful. But I said, but over in the UK we don't really have conservative Quakers, so there's no conservative Quaker meeting I could go to, for example. And the American friend was very shocked, and he said, "What? You don't have conservative friends? I mean, do you have any other branches of Quakerism?" And I said, "No, it's just liberal Quakerism." And he was flummoxed by this. And to be honest, so was I. So I thought I would do a two-parter. Well, we'll see how this goes. Either one video looking at two different things, or multiple videos looking at different things. I'm not sure how this is going to go, but basically looking at UK Quakerism versus US Quakerism. What are the differences and perhaps why? So looking at where that is at the moment, and also leading to going back as to why is that the case? What led to US Quakerism being different to UK Quakerism? The fact that they're different is actually quite astounding when you think of it, because although yes, there are hundreds and thousands of Quakers worldwide, Quakerism is obviously a very small denomination. And so that there is such disparity between how Quakerism is done in different groups amongst different groups of Quakers is quite strange. All the more that there is such a difference between Quakerism in America and Quakerism in the UK, considering obviously the close history between these two countries, but also actually the very, very close, right from the very beginning, the close interaction between British Quakers and American Quakers. They were, George Fox, right from the very beginning, was going over to America. And William Penn, obviously very famously as well, but all the way into the 1800s, a lot of the major shifts and that a lot of the causes of the branches that exist in America were caused by British Quakers. More on that later. And vice versa. There's a very interesting one where an American Quaker did help cause a schism in England as well. So it's very fascinating that though there was a lot of communication, such different branches came out of it, and also how we were each responsible for those shifts. So in very broad terms, in America, you have four major strands, I suppose, of Quakerism, which can also be found in different parts of the world as well. There's liberal Quakerism, there's evangelical Quakerism, conservative Quakerism, which is where this story all began, and what we would call programmed Quakerism. Whereas in England, there is Quakerism, which is most like liberal Quakerism in America, but has a completely different development to it. It's not like they were liberal Quakers over in America and they brought that over and we've just copied and pasted it. It's not actually as simple as that. So how did this all happen, and where's that led these two strands of Quakerism, or where's it led transatlantic Quakerism to be? I suppose it's not really any surprise that American Quakerism is more diverse than British Quakerism, just because of the size and the distance involved. It's hardly surprising that differences in beliefs and practices developed over that time. It was it still is a much more religious country than Britain was or is, certainly. And so things like the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, which happened in America, never really happened in the UK to the same level. And obviously they had effects on the changes that happened in Quakerism as well. So whereas in England, obviously, it is a lot easier for a small group of a small religious group to remain relatively intact. Now, that's not to say at all that British Quakerism hasn't gone through strands, certainly has, and that has been linked to what's been going on to America and also vice versa. So British Quakerism hasn't always been at all what it is now, what we might call modern Quakerism. It certainly has gone on a trajectory so these strands are inherently linked to their history. So we'll go off and we'll talk about that a little bit. So in terms of the history of British Quakerism and in terms of how the flavor has changed throughout its history, you can follow it on a single line of trajectory. It doesn't tend to break too much. There are rifts in between that, but overall, you can look at early Quakerism, second generation or later early Quakerism, pretty much ending in the early 1700s, a period called Quietism, which leads up until in England up until probably the early mid 1800s, a period of evangelicalism, which dies out towards the end of the 19th century, and then liberal Quakerism or modern Quakerism coming out of the 20th century. And I would argue that early liberal Quakerism is different quite a lot from modern liberal Quakerism, especially in the UK. So, but it follows that line, and although there are splinter groups, or we're going off at every single point of that change, there was never any major break that led to different yearly meetings being set up or different Quaker bodies at any point being set up. Now, this is not true in America. Up until the 1800s, I think it's probably fair enough. I mean, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but I think it's probably fair enough to say that the style and the everything to do with Quaker worship on one side of the Atlantic was pretty much the same as on the other. I suppose from what I gather, the difference may be that certainly by the 1800s, say, I'd say that British Quakers were perhaps more urban than the Quakers in America, who I understand maybe were a bit more rural. But in terms of their actual Quakerishness, they were in plain dress. They were using "thee" as their as the second person pronoun, and they were worshipping in very much the same way. And I suppose we know that because, for example, John Woolman, who was in the 18th century, but latter half of the 18th century, went to England, and if Quakers were worshipping in a very different way, he would have written about it in his journal. He doesn't, so one would assume that there's relative conformity on both sides of the Atlantic. And in America, things started to change with the preaching of Elias Hicks, and this led to the Great Separation, it's called, between what became Hicksite Quakers and Orthodox Quakers. Those groups have changed and don't necessarily relate to everything today, but effectively Hicksites eventually became the liberal Quakers. So one can argue, I'm sure, that there are differences between Hicksite Quakerism and liberal Quakerism, in the same way that I would argue personally that there's a difference between early liberal Quakerism in Britain and modern liberal Quakerism in Britain. And I believe in Britain this was overall condemned. I don't think that Elias Hicks's teaching got any real roots in the UK at that time. Interestingly, though, probably the most, if you're going to talk about any real Quaker schism in the UK, it probably is related to the teaching of Elias Hicks. So Americans having an effect on British Quakerism, and was called the Beaconite controversy. Again, I'm paraphrasing at the moment just to get to the ultimate end point of where we are. I will do this in a lot more detail later on, but effectively, this was where people were going absolutely probably the other way to where Elias Hicks was going in reaction to him. So going pretty much so that it was Reformed theology, that they weren't using Quaker theology anymore to talk about things like the inner light. They moved away from that and became effectively a maybe Methodist, maybe, and certainly became a lot more evangelical with a biggie than perhaps British Quakers were less necessarily happy with. So the Beaconites separated. That was led by a guy called Isaac Crewdson, and they created the whole new meeting and separated completely. But it never really picked up, and so died off, and so British Quakerism moved on. Yeah. This whole point of one of the whole points of the video. Another really important point about the Beaconite controversy is that although it was led by Isaac Crewdson and he was the forerunner, it was also heavily influenced by a guy called Elisha Bates, who was an American Quaker, and a lot of his ministry and a lot of his interactions with the Beaconites did help to lead to this controversy. So Americans affecting Britons. But now, in the next one, we're going to go the other way. And we're going to look at a British Quaker affecting a major shift in American Quakerism. Enter Joseph John Gurney. And he was very much a heavyweight in British Quakerism. I think he is related to Elizabeth Fry, who used to be on the £5 notes, and did a lot for prison reform, which is why she's on there. But he is certainly in Quakerism one of the most important Quakers of the 1800s, certainly. Not just because of the split that he caused in America, but even if he hadn't, the books that he's written were of some considered the best in terms of explaining Quaker theology since Berkeley, which is a common thing you hear. But actually, I think from what I understand, I haven't actually read it because it's really expensive. It seems to be the case of that's how it was felt at the time. So because at the time, Hicksite Quakers weren't in fellowship with British Quakers, the Orthodox Quakers was where Joseph John Gurney went, and it slowly became clear that he had a very in terms of his view on Jesus Christ as Savior, as on the atonement, he was in quite a different position to quite a lot of people on the Orthodox side of those arguments. He was probably very much in line with other Protestant Christian groups of the era. So, in terms of things like the atonement, he would be a penal substitutionalist, and a very high view of the role of Jesus as Savior, as a historical figure as well, which for some Quakers wasn't necessarily what the focus was, where it certainly was for Joseph John Gurney. So this led to another split. So the Orthodox then split into two. You had the Wilburites, who were led by John Wilbur. Oh, they're all John. It is John. John Wilbur, and he led the Wilburites, who eventually become the conservative Quakers. And they basically hold this very interesting, which is why, going back to the beginning, this is why I find them very interesting. They hold this very tenuous position of being quite conservative when it comes to their theology. So you will not find any atheists, conservative Quakers. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're conservative politically or anything like that, but you won't find any atheist Quakers or any of these meldings of two strands and Quakerism coming together in conservative Quakerism. So they have quite a very Christian theology, but then in terms of their practice, they are very what would be similar to a liberal. So they do their ministries, they do their worship solely in silence with verbal ministry when led, which from a liberal perspective sounds precisely what we do. So they're kind of right in the middle there. The other groups that we haven't then mentioned are the evangelical Quakers, who basically are very similar to where the the Gurneyites, as they were called, eventually they started getting ministers in, so having programmed meetings, which means that they're led by a minister, not led by not led by the group when led. But the evangelical Quakers take it one step further, and they actually have churches which is effectively a Christian service with a Quaker tint, but is a lot more recognizable as a Protestant in America. Of other denominations coming to that would seem very similar to what they were used to, rather than maybe if they went to a liberal Quaker meeting or a conservative liberal meeting. Gurneyites are nowadays called more likely programmed Friends or programmed Quakers, where there is a program, there might be a minister, but there is still significant time given to silence and individual ministry as well. And so that's where we are today. In Britain, the changes happened at different times. So as I said, liberal Quakerism in America started a lot earlier. At that time, British Quakerism was very evangelical, capital E, and it wasn't really until the late 1800s that 1885 is considered the watershed moment of when there was a massive conference in Manchester. And then liberal Quakerism started to take sway. But then that liberal Quakerism that came in Britain was influenced not by Elias Hicks so much, but by another American, Rufus Jones. And I would also say, along with John Wilhelm Rowntree, who were basically the founders of British liberal Quakerism. Not quite, but nearly 100 years after Hicksite Quakerism began in America. And it's this liberal Quakerism which leads to a lot of informs a lot of modern day liberal Quakerism today. It still had a very Christian center, and I think a lot of them hadn't quite. They started liberal Quakerism mainly as a way to combine Quaker beliefs with science and mainly with science. But I don't think they quite saw the ramifications of that would lead to Quakerism losing, or certainly losing, where Christianity would lose its prominence within Quakerism. I don't think they quite saw it. So early liberal Quakerism in Britain was still very Christian. It wasn't until probably maybe after the war, or maybe going into the 80s, where that Christian element certainly was lost, or lost its importance, maybe certainly for quite a lot of British Quakers today. So that's what leads us with today in America, in some states. Although actually, well, I'm not sure if there are any states, I'm happy to be proven wrong, where all four flavors of Quakerism are available. I know there are certainly states where multiple are. So there might be a conservative meeting, there might be an evangelical meeting, or there might be a program meeting and an unprogrammed meeting, or a semi-programmed meeting, which exists as well, confusingly. But there's just a lot more choice. Which there's good and there bad things about that. You could say, well, it's good that there's choice because you can find precisely the type of Quakerism that fits you. But then it makes it harder yet again, and Quakerism already has that issue. It makes it harder to actually explain what Quakerism is to an outsider, because if you say, Quakerism might look like this in my meeting, but if you go to the meeting in the next state, or even in the next town, it's going to look radically different. That's a really hard message to try and sell, to try and talk to other people about Quakerism. That being said, as I said right at the beginning, in England, you've only got liberal Quakerism. Now, in that there's scope. So, there are going to be people in every meeting that have Christian tendencies. There's going to be certainly Quakers in every group that have atheist tendencies. And so we kind of have that all in one meeting, which I think is nice and coherent, but it means that we're dealing with constantly a constant tension between people of different beliefs, because there's nowhere else for anyone to go unless they want to leave Quakerism entirely. So if they don't want to leave Quakerism, then they're kind of stuck with having to deal with that tension and deal with people that think radically different, if not completely opposite of what they believe. But at the same time, I think that's really important. I think we don't want to live in an echo chamber. We do that enough anyway. I think it's wrong for us to be separated from each other just because we don't necessarily believe precisely the same things. I think that's precisely the point. We have to try and build this community. It's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be filled with people who just feel the same way, because that's not a community, is it? That's just people, or that's like a fan base, I suppose. But the true community will have people of all varieties in it, and I think that's what's really important. And yes, it's frustrating when you hear people say, well, that's not what I think Quakerism is, but your interpretation of Quakerism is just as valid as the next person. So I think, and at no point, I don't think it's ever going to be the case that Quakerism is going to be completely atheist or completely Christian again. In that, it's always going to be a mix. There's going to be, and I think I like that it's all in one community. Yes, of course, I'd like to see what it's like in a conservative Quaker meeting. I think that'd be really interesting. In the same way, I think it'd be really interesting to see an evangelical Quaker meeting, just to see what it's like. I have no experience of that. But I think ultimately, and maybe it's just because I am a British Quaker, I think that's probably where I feel most at home. So I hope maybe this video has cleared up what Quakerism looks like if you're a US viewer, what Quakerism looks like in the UK and why it's different. And if you're a UK Quaker, why it is that maybe American Quakers look so different. But as I said, I will be doing, in my Quaker history series, I will be doing the actual how this actually played out in a lot more detail. So please do keep an eye out for that. And I'd be very interested also. For example, I listened to the Quaker podcast a couple of weeks ago. Now they went to Australia, and I was fascinated by hearing about like what Australian Quakerism was, because we don't tend to hear so much about that. We hear a lot about American Quakers, and I hope I'm doing my bit to hear let people hear what British Quakerism is like. But what's Quakerism like? I know Quakerism in Ireland's got its own very different heritage as well. So I'd be very interested to hear if people think that their version of Quakerism in their countries got a different heritage to British Quakerism or American, or strands of American Quakerism, or how they've blended. That'd be really fascinating to hear. So please do let me know. But thank you very much for watching, and do stay tuned for those history videos when they come out. See you next time.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.